Today, we become legends.
Explaining every Conquest role in 2 minutes or less, let's go. This will be general strategy and not specific builds or gods to play so as to not date the video within a month or two when the meta changes, but let's get started. Solo lane in Smite is located on the Fire Giant side of the map near blue buff. Solo lane in Smite is dominated by tanks, warriors and guardians, since they see most of the action in this role, but it is by far the most diverse role in terms of what can actually be truly viable there, and even some mages and assassins have worked here in the past. The solo laner's early game goals are pretty much solely to farm up, whether you do this through efficient minion management and taking camps or by dominating the 1v1 laning against your opponent, that part is up to you, but early on in the game you're trying to farm and get a lead on the rest of the map as the solo laner. In the mid game, you're looking to maintain any lead you got from the early game or catch up if you are behind, while also starting your rotations. In the mid game, you should be ahead of the rest of the match in terms of levels and gold by at least a little bit, and a key solo lane rotation in the mid game can tip the scales of a team fight in your favour to take objectives and actually start winning the game. In the late game, full 5v5 teamfights and Fire Giant are in play. The solo laner here is looking to play a frontline role, diving the enemy backliners, that being the mid and the ADC of course, to keep them busy and maybe even kill them if you're feeling yourself or if you're fed. For objectives, you're looking to either tank the hits from them or zone enemies away to stop a steal attempt, for example on Fire Giant. For sieging, this is the same way. Keep enemies away so your team can take the tower or Phoenix and or tank the hits from it if necessary. Basically, your job is to make it as easy as possible for your ADC to hold left click on the Phoenix for the longest amount of time. In terms of solo lane builds, you want to be mostly tanky with 1 or 2 damage or bruiser items at the absolute most. Building defense against your lane opponent first before worrying about the rest of the team is a good way to go. So against a Guardian, build magical defense first, against a warrior, assassin, etc. build physical defense. Make sure to pay attention to the local jungle camps like your own blue buff, the Totem of Ku, the Side Harpy and the Scorpion, as they're very important in getting you incremental leads over the enemy, which is what solo lane is all about. The role is a grind, not an explosion. Many small victories win the day in solo lane, not one huge play. The mid lane in Smite is located, well, I think you get the idea. The vast majority of gods that see play here are mages, with a few hunters, mostly ability based ones, seeing some reliable play too here, depending on the meta. The mid laner is primarily a big AoE burst damage dealer for the team. Early in the game, the mid laner's main goal is getting control of the map and working with their jungler to get a lead. Of course, you need to keep up with your minion waves to get that juicy farm, but mid lane generally has a bit more to do early game than just farm. Namely, making plays with their jungler who together form the core of their team early on. Since the mid is central to the map, they're located near most of the key areas of connection early in the game. The mid jungle are key to getting pressure early on, and it can often decide the early game. In the mid game, not too much changes beyond that support will be joining you in mid. This can also happen even into the early game as well, depending on when the support wants to rotate, but I'll get more into that in the actual support section. But in the mid game, you have the core 3v3 of Conquest fully assembled, that of course being the mid, jungle and support. These 3 will roam, sometimes as a 2 or even singles, sometimes as a full 3, and get control of the map while trying to gank the side lanes of solo and ADC to get them a lead going into the late game. The core 3 are also essential to getting objectives in the mid game. In the late game, the mid laner's main objective is to provide big burst damage and zone control to the team. You'll usually be hanging out, throwing your abilities from a safe range, trying to burst down squishy targets like the enemy mid, ADC and jungler, while also trying to stay alive and survive dives from the enemy jungle and solo. In terms of builds for mid lane, you're almost always going full burst damage, whether that's magical damage for your mages or physical for your hunters, though there are some occasions where one defense item is warranted, such as a Magi's Cloak. Since we already covered mid where I talked a bit about the mid jungle core of Conquest, let's cover jungle in depth now. The jungle role in Smite is definitely the hardest role with the most to think about and do. It's also the role that gets flamed the most, usually. Sometimes that supports if they play badly, so keep that in mind. This role of course doesn't cover a lane like the others, but roams the jungle between the lanes. Getting farm from the camps and buffs in there and sometimes emerging to gank a lane to get their team ahead. Jungle is a fairly diverse role with representation from most classes, but assassins are by far the most common to see here. Early in the game, the jungler is mainly looking to farm and gank only occasionally. In terms of farm, you should prioritize camps that drop buffs for either you or your team, since keeping those up as often as possible is essential, and taking them on cooldown prevents enemy invades as well. Then in between taking buffs, or if nothing else is available, you have nothing else to do, you can take standard camps and harpies and things like that, or if it's just on your rotations or somewhere you need to be. Try to avoid leeching farm from your teammates' minion waves, as this will usually put them behind. There is enough farm in the jungle for you to live entirely off of that, unless your own team are screwing you by taking your camps and things like that. So take note that the mid laner will sometimes do camps with you early on in the game, and you'll sometimes help them with minion waves as well, so you essentially split the farm for a little bit to keep yourselves both safe. In the mid game, your job is largely the same, but shifts to focus more on ganks than farming. By this point, you should have a few items online and will be able to gank very effectively. The mid game is what mostly decides who has a lead going into the late game, and so ganking your lanes to get them ahead at this point is the best thing you can do. But of course, be sure to balance ganks with farm and not fall behind. If you're ganking all the time but you're 2 levels down the whole game, you probably would be better off farming up a little bit and only ganking a few times with an even or level lead. In the late game, your primary goal as a jungler is to dive the backline and kill the enemy mid and ADC. You can of course deviate from this, maybe pick off an out of position enemy jungler or something like that, but your general game plan is to assassinate the enemy backline, since you should have strong movement and damage as the jungler to get in, kill them and get out. Moving on though, let's cover the final piece of the core 3v3 Conquest, the support. This role's primary job is to protect their team and keep them alive, primarily the mid and ADC, but you can also protect solo or jungle if needed. This role is sort of a hybrid between a laning role and a roaming role, as supports will tend to roam where they're needed most rather than sticking to one lane. The most common gods and supports are guardians, but some gods from other classes can see play here too, such as a few warriors or tanky assassins. Early in the game, the supports lane in duo with the ADC, gaining farm and protecting their ADC while assisting them with their weak early game. From there, the support will tend to rotate out of that lane and roam more towards mid where they can get more opportunities, which is where the core 3v3 of Conquest forms. The mid support and jungler in Smite tend to roam the central parts of the map looking to gain control on objectives and taking fights where needed, ganking side lanes as well to get them ahead of their direct lane opponent. In the late game, the support's main goal is to keep their carries alive in teamfights through crowd controlling enemies, creating space for the team and supporting their teammates with buffs. Your main focus in teamfights as support is your ADC and your mid. Try to peel for both, but if you have to pick between them, pick the one that's doing your best, so focus the efforts on keeping them alive. And finally we have the ADC role. Residing in the duo lane, this role is very much a laning role with a long laning phase of 2v2 with the support and 1v1 versus the enemy ADC. For this reason, individual skill is emphasized pretty heavily when playing ADC. The god roster of ADC is quite varied, but mostly consists of hunters and magical ADCs, aka Chronos, Sol, Freya and Olorun, along with another few oddball picks you'll see occasionally, but you'll mostly be seeing hunters in this role. Early in the game, the ADC's primary job is to farm up. Whether you get that farm lead by clearing waves and camps efficiently, or by killing the enemy ADC in the 1v1, that doesn't matter. It's much like solo lane in that regard. Just know that you need to get big from all that solo farm that you're going to be getting in the ADC role, because you tend to be weaker early in the game and ramp up as you go. In the mid game, you'll start to roam out of your lane and look to participate in teamfights around key objectives in the map, especially the Gold Fury, which lies right next to duo lane, so it's very convenient for you to help with that. However, you do still need to keep up as much farm as possible during this phase to get your build online, where ADCs can really start shredding. Speaking of, your job in the late game is basically just to shred everything in sight while staying alive. Easy, right? Well, yes, but staying alive can be easier said than done when you're being dived by a solo laner and the jungler at the same time. Which is where the support comes in that we discussed earlier. They should hopefully be peeling for you, so stay close to them if you can in teamfights and don't run off on your own, as you're an extremely important part of the late game strategy for your team. Being the main objective damage as well as the main sieging for towers, phoenixes and titans. If you die, it's really not good. By this point in the game though, you should be near full build and your damage output should be unrivaled except by maybe the mid laner, so you should be able to dominate teamfights if you're kept alive. But that's it, every Conquest role explained in under 2 minutes each. I know a lot of new players have trouble understanding the basics of the role system, and so never actually get into the meat of what makes Conquest so enjoyable. So if this actually helps you out, then be sure to drop a like before you leave, and I'll catch you guys later. Have a great day, and peace out you nerds.